Another working week draws to a close. It's Friday, the 10th of September, 2021. You're watching The Quest with me, Addiel Sabir. Now, as the world ushered in the new millennium, the world also came to terms with some very stark numbers. And what do I mean by numbers? Well, the numbers are two numbers, one date, two landmarks, and one unknown fate. Now, those numbers are 9 and 11, read as September the 11th, 2001. The two landmarks, the Pentagon building and the World Trade Center, which were hit by manned hijacked aircraft and forever changed the course of history. Now, those scenes will forever be etched in people's minds, but also we as a civilization came to learn new words in our vocabulary: the war on terror, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, a daisy cutter, Tora Bora, Operation Enduring Freedom. Now, tomorrow, on the eve today, we will see Afghanistan, the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, swear in a new cabinet. This following the withdrawal of US forces. Joe Biden sticking to his election promises that he would bring troops back from this forever war. But was it a forever war which has now come to a close? This forever still lingers with many Americans, the 3,000 or so who lost their lives that day back in 2001, and for those thousands and thousands who were affected in Afghanistan and in neighboring countries like Pakistan, who itself lost over 70,000 civilians. Before we come to the oath-taking, and some of the critical points of this oath-taking are which countries which have been invited will actually attend and therefore give some degree of recognition to the Afghan Taliban. Don't forget, back then in 2001, there were only 3 countries which were recognized in the Afghan Taliban. That was namely Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Now, as the tides are changing, so too are the dynamics in this region. Now, to help us understand a little bit more, we're joined by James Dorsey, who is a senior fellow at Singapore's Middle East Institute. Thank you, James, for joining us. And Lieutenant General retired Ghulam Mustafa, who is a defence analyst. Both panelists, thank you for joining me. I just want to quickly begin with you, James. Before we get into the oath-taking ceremony, if you were to write a history book yourself, James, what would be the single biggest lesson that you would pencil for the world from this last 2 decades?
I think everyone, of course, and without question, that is extremely important, would point to what we're seeing, the problems that the U.S. has encountered in terms of its own democracy, and that's true for the rest of the West too. The issues that have come to the fore in terms of Islamophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, and of course the role of the United States in the world, as you know, colored by having been defeated in Afghanistan. And I think all of that is true, but in many ways, I would argue that perhaps what makes bin Laden already early in the 21st century one of the most important figures in the 21st century is that with really very little money and one stroke, he undermined the cohesion of societies across the globe. So, with other words, he destroyed the principle of multiculturalism in Europe at a moment that Europe was coming to grips with the fact that it no longer was, by and large, a homogeneous society, that it had become an immigration society, and that meant a fair amount of adjustment. He is the father of 21st century Islamophobia. That Islamophobia, coupled with the fallout of wars like Afghanistan, like Iraq, namely the migration crisis, has brought to the fore populist, not exclusively, there are other factors that play a role here, of course, but helped to bring to the fore populist, supremacist, racist tendencies, or in any case, those tendencies which have been marginalized within society suddenly were no longer taboo. They became mainstream. And that's really a fundamental shift that I think is as important as all the other things that people have pointed out.
A dynamic shift indeed. Lieutenant General Ghulam Mustafa, if you were to write a history book yourself, of course, I would like you to point out perhaps the biggest lesson for the United States, given the fact that the United States possibly has the largest number of graduates in the world, undergraduates, postgraduates, PhD holders, think tanks, all of these great brains in the United States. So one big lesson for the United States to take away from all of this, given the depth of minds working in the United States.
Incidentally, this kind of a brain power has always been available to various empires and various civilizations which were at their peak at different times in history. One lesson is that there is a fall to every rise. And then when you are at the height, and the next is only way is to go your way down. I would suggest, and I think as a military man, first and most important thing is that must recognize who your real enemy is. And number two, must also realize that you are fighting that enemy on the same battlefield. It's not that you are trying to fight a battle on a battlefield where the enemy is just partially present, is not even there. And then if you don't recognize the main strength of the enemy, you can never ever win the war. And finally, I think when you enter any conflict, any competition, you should know what time and how and what are the circumstances which will dictate that you should now exit or leave it as a good job or a bad job. But these things come very, very difficult. It's not easy. I can say that now. From the hindsight, it's come very, very difficult.
Of course, I mean, it's taken four
These civilizations.
Sorry, I was just going to say it's actually taken 4 presidencies to come to this actual actionable withdrawal. Just want to quickly, if I may, John, I'm just bringing Salman Javed, who's the director of the Pak-Afghan Youth Forum. Thanks for joining us. Salman, an entire generation who grew up post-2001, that's some 20 years ago, that's an entire generation who's grown up in 2 decades of war. What kind of a youth has emerged, do you think, post 9/11, and of course, what kind of a youth can we expect now that the United States has exited?
The kind of generation that was born or that was raised after 2001, after the invasion of Americans inside Afghanistan, they actually believe in 2 things. Number one, the stories that they heard about the previous Afghan regime, Taliban regime from 1996 to 2001. And the other stories that they have heard and which were told to them time and again were about Pakistan and the role of Pakistan in Afghanistan. These 2 things have been, manifested in their curriculum, in their ideology, in their all kind of ideas. So whatever you see coming from Afghanistan will be focused on 2 things. Number one is that the rule of Taliban will take away every democratic element out of Afghanistan, and whatever they have gained in last 2 decades, it will be rolled back by the regime of Taliban. And the second thing is that this Taliban regime and the previous Taliban regime both have been installed inside Afghanistan or both have been supported inside Afghanistan by Pakistani elements. So this is the kind of generation that we have to deal with right now in Afghanistan, and this is the generation which is right now is representing Afghanistan on the media forums around the world as well. So the narrative which has been propagated or been generated from Afghanistan's diaspora sitting outside of Afghanistan or inside Afghanistan is peddling this kind of narrative around these two points. Therefore, you would see that there was a kind of exodus, so to speak, the kind of terminology that the Western media used for the refugees who try to get out of Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul. But there are a lot of other young generation sitting right now in Afghanistan and as well as in Pakistan as well among the refugees who would like to go back to Afghanistan or want to remain in Afghanistan and want to serve their country.
All right, well, Salman, coming over to James, Salman was telling us about the disconnect and about the suspicion or the prism of suspicion with which the Afghan youth vis-a-vis Pakistan. I just want to come back, if I may, James, to the events of 9/11 and what the legacy it leaves behind. For many years, of course, we've had so many conspiracy theories. Just want to get your take on the declassification announcement of the 9/11 documents, and will it make any difference, do you think, to American foreign policy? And do you think there's anything there that can be found, perhaps, which should lead certain individuals or certain bodies to be tried for some heinous war crimes we've seen over the past 2 decades?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. 9/11 has produced any number of conspiracies. What we're talking about in terms of the documents, at least partly talking about, are 28 pages out of the original 9/11 report. Those pages, highly redacted, were released a couple of years ago. I read them very carefully. I've got decades of researching Saudi involvement in all kinds of things, and I walked away from reading those pages with the sense that there was no hard and fast evidence. Also, I think it's a misreading of Saudi Arabia to think that the Saudi government or the Saudi state, as a state or as a government, would have been involved in 9/11 or would have had wanted anything to do with 9/11. There may, and there actually probably were, very low-level contacts and maybe even some funding, or let me rephrase this, contacts and maybe some very low-level individual funding by low-level Saudi government officials, very low-level, not senior in any form or fashion, not major amounts of money that would have funded the 9/11 operation, and not, in my mind, in any way constituting involvement of the Saudi government. What I think is far more true is the argument that Saudi Arabia, as a nation with its then Puritan religious views and its funding globally of intolerant, anti-pluralistic, supremacist religious views, created an environment, or helped to create an environment in which 9/11 became possible. One last thing, so I don't think we're going to see much in terms of the state. The last thing I want to say on this is, when I lived in Saudi Arabia, which was immediately a couple of weeks after 9/11, and reported from there, one of the things that you saw was the enormous ebb and flow, or steep hikes and falls of Saudi Arabia's economic figures, and particularly its gross domestic product per capita. So if you went back to the 1980s, Saudi Arabia at the time had a per capita income that was more or less equal to the United States, of around $18,000 to $20,000 per capita. In 2001, that was $8,000. With other words, it had gone down by 100%. And a lot of Saudis were struggling to make ends meet by trying to hold up 2 and 3 jobs. And therefore, the moves towards radicalism were not that surprising.
I want to just follow on from your obligations vis-a-vis Saudi involvement, and of course you've made it very clear that it doesn't seem that it's, the state is complicit in any way. Having said that, there are other countries who were roped into this American so-called war on terror, namely Pakistan was one which seemingly did not have any hand or did not have any dots to join. General Ghulam Mustafa, your take on the very veiled threat, which wasn't really veiled if you think about it, so when you're either with us or against us, was announced or pronounced by President Bush to General Musharraf. Some critics of General Musharraf saying that he was too hasty, but did Pakistan have one hand tied behind its back, and was that the right decision in hindsight, do you think?
I was in the service at that time. And if you go back to that time, entire world has gathered around this stand of United States of America. Could Pakistan have stayed away from it? Singled out for it? In any case, the main issue is, I think we must understand that starting at the time when communism was about to go down, this I'm talking of it in the 90s, there was this thought of the rise of political, which to the West is not acceptable, wasn't acceptable, is not acceptable anymore. It started from fundamentalism, went on to terrorism, and it eclipsed around 9/11. Now, as far as I'm concerned, and I've also read reports published in the United States and various think tanks, and right from that time onwards, I have always had doubts, because as a professional, when I look at the whole thing, it sounded incredible that Afghanistan, which hardly could, produce enough money to handle themselves, was targeted for this attack. Al-Qaeda was targeted for this attack. The mere logistics of this kind of operation is mind-boggling. If you were to ask somebody, an expert on the subject, to sit down and work it out for you, you'll be shocked to know that it's beyond the capability of even Afghanistan and Pakistan combined. So therefore, it always left a question mark. That is it going to be the same kind of lie that was weapons of mass? And I think jury is still out. I would not like to comment one way or the other, but I have a very serious doubt. That was used to target whom? There was not a single Afghan there. There was not a single Afghan involved. There was not a single Pakistani involved. Why did they come to Afghanistan? Why, when Pakistan tried to talk US out of it, let's talk to Mullah Omar, let's get him to hand over Osama bin Laden. And Mullah Omar promised, he said, okay, fine, you try him here. Or you try him in Pakistan. And try with all that, and give him fair chance to prove him is innocent. He was not allowed. So my question has always been, was this merely used to what you said, to create an environment of forever war? And by the way, this region called, the war may have reached Afghanistan around 17th, 18th century, but this has been a forever war for as long as humans wanted to develop themselves by reaching out to Indian Ocean, going across Indian Ocean, and etc., etc. So we are in the war, it's not over. Not by a long shot. War may take other ships, but we are in a war zone, whether we like it or we don't. So, with all that argument which has been talked about even today, and that symbolic swearing-in ceremony of Taliban, it may be, getting in the face of the United States of America. But I think this is a very premature, because American forces might have left. America isn't leaving this region. Not the way we think America has left the region. Therefore, my own understanding of the issue is that given the current events in the region and evolving situation overall, this 9/11 has created more problems for the world, and particularly United States of America. They lost more money, and all the things should never have been lost by superpower. They lost their own confidence. If you look around and you listen to the media in the United States of America, look at their think tanks, what they're talking about, they've lost confidence in themselves. What is their strength? Was the economy. What was their strength? Economy-driven military power and a kind of confidence that the United States brought to the table. And what has Afghanistan done? It is no more the same economic power that it was when it invaded Afghanistan. Its military power failed because, like I said in my earlier statement, they were fighting a different war. Taliban were in a different battleground, fighting a different war in a different time zone, whereas the Americans were fighting a future which actually had no ground, link up with the reality there. That is gone. And the confidence that people had faith the United States will deliver, that is gone. The status of superpower isn't as much strong, or as that aura isn't as compelling as it used to be. So therefore, there's a lot that was on stake, there's a lot which has been lost, and this is a time for reflection. That is it any profitable to continue destabilizing this region? And is it profitable to allow India and overlook whatever Indians are doing? Because just across Wagah border, the hub of terrorism, which is becoming stronger by the day. In the last 2 or 3 months, there have been a number of caches of fissile material which is being smuggled out. They are the ones which are being caught. Where is the rest? What are they being smuggled for? Where? The world isn't asking that question. The world isn't asking that major question, why a major minority in India has been targeted and targeted so badly. The world isn't asking India that you might as well be democracy, the biggest, so to speak, but 60 to 70% of the people have absolutely no say. They're not considered human.
Okay, well,
the world has to ask very, very serious questions of itself and what is happening 9/11 and post.
Okay, let's bring back in Salman. I just want to sort of maybe marry that in with what General Mustafa was saying regarding the Indian presence here in Afghanistan. You talked, Salman, a little bit about the reservations or some of perhaps the internal feelings of the Afghan vis-a-vis Pakistan's involvement in Afghanistan for the best part of the recent history that we know of. But what are the sentiments on the ground regarding India? I just want to get your take on that. Of course, India and Pakistan well documented what they think of each other, where they stand with each other diplomatically as well. But what of the Afghan, particularly the youth? I mean, did they see any degree of progress with the relationship that Afghanistan's former government was forging with India, with the amount of infrastructural projects which were being touted, and even the parliament building which was built? So what was the overall feeling regarding India, if you could just give us a little bit of an insight?
There is a kind of mixed sentiment over there among the people on the ground. When Kabul fell and post-Kabul, post-15 August, the Indian media started peddling a very negative propaganda about the Taliban regime. Therefore, the followers of Taliban and Taliban by themselves have severe reservations with regards to India now. Also, Taliban by themselves have said time and again that they would like to have cordial relations with all the stakeholders of this region. But the propaganda of India and the steps taken by the government of BJP, they have resulted in a very in a very negative picture with regards to India and Indian efforts within Afghanistan. Then India was involved in many infrastructure projects, apart from whatever covert or overt operations they were carrying out over there with regards to Pakistan. They were involved in various infrastructure projects. They have left all those projects in the middle of, and they have left the country. India was one of the first few countries who shut down their embassies and consulates in Afghanistan when the Taliban was marching towards Kabul. And when the Kabul fall happened, there was no Indians who were there. There were a very few Indians who were left there, and Taliban managed to, send them back to India on their request. So right now, there are people who belong to the previous regime, and that previous regime obviously supported the presence in Afghanistan very profoundly, and that was the reason that with the previous regime, and time and again Pakistan sent a lot of messages and a lot of evidences and dossiers to the last government with regards to Indians' covert operation against Pakistan. But now there is another voice is raising from within Afghanistan, who is very critical of Indian role within Afghanistan, and they are now projecting all those elements, negative elements that India has nurtured over there for the period of last 2 decades.
Okay, brilliant.
So we will see in the near future what will happen with India with regards to their diplomatic relations, because Indian diplomats have met Taliban political leaders.
The leadership in Doha.
Yeah.
Indeed.
After the fall of Kabul, that happened after the fall of Kabul. So on one hand,
I'm going to have to leave it there with you, Salman. Unfortunately, just running a wee bit out of time. Was Salman Javed, who's the director of the Pak-Afghan Youth Forum. I'd like to thank General Ghulam Mustafa, defence analyst, and also like to thank James Dorsey, who's senior fellow at Singapore's Middle East Institute. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on this part of programme. Time now for us to take a short break. Still to come, though, we will be discussing the latest COVID crisis and how Pakistan is faring throughout all of this. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching The Quest. This segment we're going to be focusing on COVID, particularly the situation unfolding in Pakistan. Just to give our viewers a bit of an update, of the some 220 million population, some 20 million have been fully vaccinated. 50 million have received 1 dose. If we're talking about the federal capital, the latest stats are showing that approximately 70% of those living within the federal capital, Islamabad, have had their 1 dose. Minor drop in active cases, still some 91,000 active cases, and just in the past 24 hours, there have been some 83 deaths. So, its impact, how has the situation been handled? What of the variants, and what of the economy? To help us address some of these questions, we're joined by Professor Dr. Mohammed Mukhtar. He is the Vice Chancellor and a virologist as well at the National Skills University. Thank you for your participation. And Dr. Salman Shah, who's a senior economist. If I may, can I just quickly begin with Dr. Salman. Dr. Salman, just over a year now that we've been to this pandemic. Your initial findings, given the past fiscal year, what are the indicators? How is Pakistan's economy faring overall, just based on the indicators and based on what the world has gone through? How would you say that Pakistan has fared over the past year?
Well, I think that this is a pandemic, as you know, as everybody knows, that this is once in 100 years happening. And when this started almost 2 years ago, there was absolutely no knowledge about how to manage everything on a global scale. And the impact which was apparent on the global economy was that the supply chains had been disrupted. If you look at the retail areas, they were shut down. All the transactions or purchases were suspended. And so this was for the first time that we saw that the disruption was in the markets and it then filtered back into the supply chain, to the factories and to the workplace. So I think at that time there was a total clamor that we should shut down everything and everybody has to be quarantined in their homes and isolated for many, many weeks. And in the meantime, in Pakistan or countries like Pakistan, where the social security net was non-existent or very, very shallow, there was massive fear of hunger and people dying of hunger. So I think that is what the options were, that if you don't lock down, the pandemic will get you. If you lock down, then the loss of income would devastate the already poor sections of society, and your poverty levels will dramatically decrease. And around the globe, we saw that the disruption in the economy was very high. The big economies came to a standstill. In our neighborhood, economic growth plummeted. And Pakistan also, we saw that for the first year, the economic growth became negative for the first time in almost 70 years. So I think this was the scenario in which this thing came. But overall, Pakistan first reaction was to support the people. A massive injection of resources was provided to the population, particularly the low-income groups. Almost 1.2 trillion rupees package was made in which the low-income people were supported, then the factories were supported so that they don't lay off workers. There was central bank interventions in terms of ensuring that the production chains don't get too disrupted, and which I thought was a very timely and effort, even though it was a very costly effort as far as government revenues were concerned or government finances were concerned. But it did cushion the impact of the pandemic in the early days. And at that time, Pakistan made a decision that it is not going to go for a kind of universal lockdowns. It will have to have
Smart
very
lockdowns.
selective, smart lockdowns. And that, I think, created an environment in which our factories remained open, our fields, agriculture fields were okay, the transport links were maintained. We did see some disruption in the markets in terms of, for example, hotels and wedding halls. We had some disruption in the restaurants business. And we did see a major problem in our schools because schools were very, very vulnerable to all of this, and with the lack of vaccination, opening up the schools was a very big issue. And I think that is still an area which we are handling very carefully. But we have not been able to reopen the schools in a manner that we can say, yes, we have now learned how to manage the schooling system.
If I just quickly move on, Dr. Swan, I'm bringing Dr. Mohammed Mukhtar into the conversation. Some of the stats which have been revealed by the authorities today, they are looking to still achieve the target of 70 million vaccinations. Can you just talk us through the notion of collective immunity or herd immunity? I mean, we know that supposedly the virus will stop circulating if 70% are vaccinated in a particular area. What's your take, professional take, on herd immunity? Is it technically not impossible in Pakistan?
Let me because being a virologist, yes, the concept of herd immunity exists. That's when above 80%, it differs from virus to virus, like people get like vaccinated, what happens? The transmission chain gets stopped. But in the case of this COVID-19 causing virus, SARS coronavirus 2, I'm not sure whether herd immunity even will come into play, because we have the reports like people who get vaccinated, they are also capable of transmitting virus to the other people. So that is a challenging question. People talk about herd immunity, but being a virologist, being an immunologist, so I mean, we have to see that when it will come in. And of course, like, I mean, if people are vaccinated, the chances of transmission are relatively reducing. So about this SARS coronavirus 2 that caused the disease COVID-19, we still have to learn about the herd immunity. I mean, at this time, making any prediction, I don't think anybody can do it in the accurate way.
Your take on the expected target of 70 million vaccinated by the end of the year, realistic, unrealistic, in your opinion, given what you've seen on the ground?
To be honest with you, because I have been watching the entire scenario, I mean, we appreciate our government. Like, I mean, we were among the very first countries to get the availability of vaccine. And the way it is going on, like, I think I have been able to see some of the vaccination center. They are very well equipped, very trained staff over there. So I'm quite positive, like, I mean, we will be able to, if the government has planned that one, we will be able to accomplish this one, achieve this one. That is like, I mean, and relatively, if you look into the anti-vaxxer feelings, like, I mean, I see in Pakistan, we have people, some of them who are anti-vaxxer, but not too much like in the developed world. Even if you look into the US, there is a major problem, like a lot more people, they don't want to get vaccinated.
Very quickly, Dr. Sabir, threats of variants. We know of two variants, in fact, the UK variant and the Indian variant. What more can you tell us about the variants which are now present in Pakistan, or to the degree of which they are present in Pakistan?
Look, I think they are definitely there, and we are seeing almost a third or a fourth wave going through Pakistan. And I think that the numbers compared to our past is now we are exceeding those numbers. But it somehow seems that either we are not doing enough testing, or the number of infections is not that high as compared to, let's say, Europe or United States or even India. So we somehow have managed things better. The fatalities are also have not exceeded more than 80 or 90 a day, even at the peak time, whereas we see thousands of people dying in other places which have a much smaller population. So this is somewhat of an anomaly, but we do see that our, our hospitals are not being overwhelmed, or we don't see the kind of disruption which we have seen in more advanced economies in Europe.
If I may quickly just bring in Dr. Mukhtar, sorry, Dr. Usman, just quickly just to get his quick take on the variant. From what you've seen, the two variants that we know about, how prominent or how prevalent are they, Dr. Mukhtar? What is your assessment so far on the variants?
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, I mean, we are hearing the Delta is the most prevalent variant. But we have to look into the whole story of variants. So you might have heard very recently a new variant, that is a mu variant. So I mean, the naming of variants is like these Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma. So mu is the 12th one. So it means so far in the world, there are almost 12 variants have come. And these variants basically, like World Health Organization classify in the different way. If you go to the US system, the Center for Disease Control, they classify these variants into 3 groups, which I believe in. They are like, I mean, they have presumed what can happen. So among these, like the 3 are, the first one is like variant of interest, like the this normal virus which is creating the disease, and they find out the symptoms are different, like the patient's the disease pattern is different. They start observing that one, and then they sequence the virus. Sequence is basically all the information, the genomic information of virus. And then they go into this one, like, let's say, if it is a more aggressive than its parental type, and it's spreading very fast, and they call them as a variant of concern. And so far, there are 4 variants of concern. We heard about this alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And as you know, this delta, basically, this was this emerged in India. So India and Pakistan had the same type of environment. And we were, being a virologist, when Delta was reported in Pakistan, I was much worried that, God forbid, we be safer, and we don't want to see the situations like happen in India. And thanks God, there are damages, there are problems, there is a mortality, but it's not like the one it happened in India. So, we hope to foresee, we will be able to overcome this one.
Okay, yeah, terribly sorry, gents. I'm bang out of time for this particular programme. I'd like to thank Professor Dr. Mohammed Mukhtar, who's been joining us. He's the Vice-Chancellor at the National Skills University, and of course, Dr. Salman Shah, Senior Economist, for shedding light on how Pakistan has been handling it over the past year or so. Right, that concludes this week's programming. Of course, do keep your eyes tuned on what's coming up over the weekend, particularly tomorrow, 9/11 anniversary, 20 years on. What has the world learnt? What has the world achieved? Till then, have yourselves a very pleasant weekend. Take care. Goodbye.